Hi, you guys. Welcome back for our track 2 session. For this session, we have with us Jennifer Drew discussing how OM actually strikes the whole family when this diagnosis occurs. Oh, that is not what I want. Sorry. Okay, so Jennifer Drew is someone who earned her master's degree in social work from the University of California, and she is currently a licensed clinical social worker with advanced certifications in oncology and palliative care. Let's give a warm welcome to Jennifer Drew.
Good morning. Thank you for the warm welcome. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for being here with us.
My pleasure. I'm happy to be here. It's an amazing organization, and Cure Insight is fantastic, along with all the sponsors making this possible today.
I agree, for sure. I'm definitely grateful to them. So, we're really excited for your presentation. Do you have some slides that you're going to be pulling up?
I sure do. There you go. That would be the
Okay,
first one.
perfect.
So, should I take it away?
Take it away.
All right. Thanks so much. Good morning, everybody, and good afternoon on the East Coast. I am here today to talk about the impact of OM on the entire family. And when we talk about the entire family, we really want to think about who the whole family. The whole family is not just the biological family, it's not just our partners, our children, our parents, well meaning extended family, cousins, nephews, aunts, and uncles. It could be a friend, it could be a patient who's also going through the exact same diagnosis. It could be a colleague, it could be your treatment team. The whole family in this case can be everybody that you come in contact with or that your loved one comes in contact with when they're working with OM diagnosis. And caring for a loved one with cancer doesn't mean the same thing to all people. All reflections, all meanings are really important. There might be inner conflict, outer conflict. There might be conflict within each caregiver or between caregivers as roles, responsibilities come to light, as roles and responsibilities are defined. As time passes, things change and needs change. Finding meaning as a caregiver may change across situations and personal relationships. Meaning may change sexually, with intimacy, financially, existentially, socially, and spiritually. There might be considerations of diversity when we're looking at who makes up the entire family. So if we look at all the different peoples and more who could make up the family, the goal becomes cooperation. So not only the family and the local family, long distance family, the medical team, as I mentioned, the social network who becomes another aspect of family. Well meaning colleagues, people you even come into contact with in other situations or groups. It could be a spiritual family. The important thing around working with the entire family for any patient is to know as a caregiver to keep your cool. Don't allow situations to cause you to, quote unquote, blow your stack. What you want to do when you come into a situation is to breathe. And what I mean by that is time. Take the time to really think about what's going on. What is it that's causing you to be irritated or upset or scared? What is it that's causing you to have a response right now? Are there some long-standing challenges in the relationships with either local or long-distance family or friends, colleagues? What we want to remember is that the problem is not the problem. What's going on beneath the problem? Because if we're just working on the surface level of the problem, um, we're not really getting to what it is either your patient with the diagnosis needs or the other people who make up the patient's family need. So, what we want to do is start thinking about how caregiving is gaining awareness and patience through really clear communication, establishing roles, establishing boundaries, and working together to define what it is your loved one with OM needs. What we have to think about that the person with the diagnosis, yes, the diagnosis affects them directly. They might have a heightened level of anxiety, heightened level of irritability. They might struggle with depression, panic attacks. It could vary from person to person. But it's really understanding that if somebody's irritable and short tempered, is that we don't want to work at that surface level. We want to understand what's causing it. Is that person afraid? Are they struggling with issues of life and death or losing sight? What is it that's really going on? So, what we want to think about is that the type of person we're working with, is it a child, an adult, or an elderly person who has the diagnosis? Think about the different needs that might be present at each stage of life. A pediatric patient and an elderly patient will have different needs than perhaps a young or middle aged adult. Caregivers and the whole family need to work together as a point of communication to navigate across this entire group of people who make up the family for any patient sitting with OM. What caregivers can do is help to understand their own limits and needs and understand the limits and needs of the patient. A caregiver oftentimes gives altruistically. There's so many different reasons why somebody becomes a caregiver. It could be somebody who is, in fact, the immediate family of the patient. But then again, if you look at the social network, that could be a caregiver as well. And the medical team becomes part of the family caring for the patient. And of course, the patient themselves. What we want to be mindful of, what we want to think about is the fact that in a blended family situation where maybe there might have been strife or tension, how do we work within the context and confines of relationships to create new understandings when that's exactly what the patient needs? So, understanding the unique family, the culture of everybody who is functioning as a caregiver for our patients. What we want to think about is different parenting styles for either children or elderly patients who might need an extra level of support. We want to think about the needs of siblings. And we want to think about limiting the setting and managing behaviors for a pediatric patient. We want to reassure patients as they express emotions. And it's important to see that we do have emotions, and that's something that we need to perhaps model for our younger and older patients or who don't have a cultural background that includes resolving conflict or sitting with uncomfortable emotions. So, what is the role of the whole family in OM? So, if we think about it, what we've been talking about is communication. What we and start to develop is the ability to be clear and specific with questions, requests, and answers to the person asking them. Provide guidance when that's requested by the patient that is supportive and positive. And of course, identify roles and responsibilities. One thing that you want to do is not try to fix things, and that can be particularly difficult. Sometimes men are oriented to wanting to fix things, but with a diagnosis, with treatment, it's incredible for us to fix anything. So, what we want to start to do is ask our loved one or the person we're caring for, What is it they're looking for? Do they just want somebody to listen, or do they need somebody to fix something that's going on for them? Ask open-ended questions rather than questions that can be answered in a yes or a no. And understand that your role as a caregiver may be different from the patient's role. The role that you're playing may be different from their well-meaning friends or their colleagues or people of different generations and cultures. You want to provide this supportive, positive judgment and refrain from lecturing the patient. And I think that's one thing that can sometimes be difficult when we're working with patients of different generations, whether it's our parents, children, siblings, understanding that lecturing is not what somebody really needs. So, what you can do is think of creating a problem solving process with the patient. Have an open and honest conversation with them about what works, what helps trying to resolve crises. Do you need a scribe when you're going to medical appointments? Do you need me to sit here and listen when you're having a bad day? Tell me about your fears. Should we involve clergy? Do you have a spiritual or religious orientation that can be brought into the conversation? And really understanding that there's so many roles that the family members can play. So just here is a very short list of some of the caregiver roles and family roles. And if we look at them, we're talking about spiritual, maybe activities of daily living, even just driving someplace, getting to appointments, financial support is a big one. If the patient was in fact a primary caregiver in the family and they're taking a break from work and incomes have shifted, that can create stress for everybody. Uh, Roles in the families or caregivers can include insurance, home management, companionship, certainly health advocacy. A lot of times there's so many appointments and people involved in treatment that it can be really difficult to just be an advocate for health care for our loved one with this diagnosis. Also, sometimes medication management, physical needs, personal care needs, emotional support. So there's so many different roles that are taking place inside the family that it's important to remember to take self as a caregiver, to understand that the family beyond the patient also needs support. Self-care is something we'll get into a little bit more later, but it's really important to remember to take that breath, to take a walk, to hit the pause button if you are experiencing a lot of stress. If you're having more stress and taking on your loved one's stress, finding a way to reset. But understanding that sometimes certain people will fill one part of the role as a caregiver or family member, and a different family member could take on a role. There could be people filling in for transportation, another group doing medication management, another group doing emotional support. So it really varies from role in the family and the larger family. So this diagnosis, OM, changed everything. The diagnosis of cancer is basically an invitation to the possibility of our own mortality as well as that of our loved ones sitting with this new diagnosis. A diagnosis can remind us that we are not in control. The world is not as predictable as we once believed. A diagnosis can come out of nowhere with speed, lightning. In understanding that this diagnosis is in fact a huge challenge. Treatment starts and we caught up in the whirlwind of activity. But understanding, in addition to activity, especially if there's young children in the home, that we have to be present not only for our patient or friend with the diagnosis, but also for our own families and for ourselves. We're invited to consider courage, to face our fears of distance, disability, disfigurement, dependence, to face our own fears that our loved one who's working with the diagnosis might be experiencing as well. And we might be experiencing concepts of life and death. Typically, people struggling with a serious diagnosis will have existential concerns. Why am I suffering? Why is this happening? How can I find meaning and purpose in this experience? And that goes for the family as well. For the family to with an idea about how can I find meaning and purpose. Caregivers may periodically reflect upon the meaning of the changes they are experiencing. Or you might be able to hire a home health in the home to help. And if it needs a hospital bed, what does that mean for intimacy? How does providing dressing changes, if needed, change a relationship with a loved one or a family? Is providing changes to somebody who needs maybe help toileting? How does that change relationship between a primary partner? And what do the changes and the role that the caregiver previously provided mean for the family? Initially, the most obvious impact could be on work or finances. If, in fact, the patient were the primary income earner for the household, it can place the household at higher risk for financial distress. And caregivers might have to take disability, state disability, federal disability, and they might need to take time away from work. There might be this financial aspect to what's going on when a patient needs treatment for OM and needs the support of the family. It might require, in fact, having somebody else help out with children or elderly parents who might also be caregiving. Caregivers may also feel the need to turn down new job opportunities because they are prioritizing caregiving for the family member with the diagnosis. Might have to work for a few hours or retire early. And what's really important to think about is that a caregiver may, in fact, face the same challenges around career that the patient themselves is facing due to demands of to support our patient family member. So it's really important to think more than 10% of patients and caregivers indicated that they miss some part of work while with their loved one. So not only is the impact potentially financially, the impact on family identity, roles, and daily life can be profound. Caring for a person with cancer often brings families together with membership and supporting one another. However, the pressures of cancer and caregiving may also reignite old family conflicts or create new ones. These conflicts can make it difficult for family members to work together. And in this time where family members can be a completely diverse set of individuals, what we want to think about existing family dynamics, new family dynamics, daily home routines, the relationship, as I mentioned, may change. The idea of dependence of the family member on others who may, in fact, have been working completely independently and individually for their whole life up until this diagnosis suddenly hit them. Talking about role balance and parent child relationships, whether you're the parent or the child of somebody with an OM diagnosis, or whether or not you now have additional household and caregiving responsibilities in your own home, in addition to roles and responsibilities outside the home. Role identity, family identity, these can change daily life so quickly. What gets undermined potentially is the routine and the stability of life, including all family members and caregiving tasks and help coming up with some type of schedule, a type of way to help with maybe things like grocery shopping, food preparation, transportation. And it does, in fact, sometimes take a village for this to happen. What can really help, in addition to schedules and boundaries, is thinking about the content you're talking about with somebody and feeling. So, the idea of listening to fix or listening to listen. Listening is probably the most important skill in addition to all the activity in life, but listening is the most important skill, letting the patient know that you're listening. And again, going back to the idea of, does the person you're speaking with, do they need a fix or do they need an ear? Which is the thing that this person's listening to? We might miss that. And, in cancer diagnoses, there's a cult of positivity. So just think positive, just be positive. Well, I know from working with many, many clients with cancer over the years that this idea of saying to somebody, be positive, it really becomes difficult for the patient to feel safe to express their more challenging emotions. Their emotions that have them scared, thinking of different existential ideas. So it's important to think about, what am I listening with? Am I listening with my own fears and concerns, or am I listening to listen to what's really going on for my loved one? So caregiver communication becomes incredibly important. Respect your feelings, needs, and desires, and don't subvert or don't hide the fact that you have emotional, physical needs, or needs at all for those of your loved one. It's important to say that you are having feelings using I statements, like, I feel sad that you're working with this diagnosis. I feel sad that your vision has changed. I feel sad and scared. I feel angry. I am angry with spirit, God. Instead of blaming the patient and telling them, you're ignoring me, or I didn't hear you. This is using basic active listening. So I feel X when you say Y. You know, I need to take some time because I'm feeling such and such. So finding out what your needs are, why you're having a reaction that might be stressful, and sitting with those responses, sitting with those ideas, able to communicate openly. And this might be really difficult when this is not a pattern of communication that already exists in a relationship. And focused on the present, do not bring up old resentments, old hurts, and encourage anybody else in the family that's part of the caregiver team and the whole family to let any bygones be bygones, that this is not the time to bring up grudges and hurtful statements. It's the time to come together, to bond, and to be together, to support each other and the patient. Don't ignore the elephant in the room. It is something that happens so often. People get scared of the word cancer. They don't understand what ocular melanoma is. They're confused. So they don't know what to say. They don't know how to speak to the patient. And the patient might respond to your saying, this is a really scary time for us. You're not alone. I'm here for you. I've got this. You can tell me when you're scared, when you're sad. I'll do whatever I can do to help you through this. I may be wrong or say the wrong things from time to time, but let me know. Create an opening with the patient and with the family members who form up the entire caregiving family, and let them know that this is the time where we can really talk to each other and find out what it is. And this open communication is going to be the key when things get tough, or if things get tough, if treatment plans change. Understanding that you have a forum and creating a forum from the get go to have open and honest communication, to let the patient know we can do this together. Let us try to be open with each other and work through what happens no matter what. And if you have children, let's talk to our kids. Kids know things. And so hiding diagnosis treatment complications, hiding things from children is actually worst. Taking the time to be honest with children and other people in the world, it's important to have that level of honesty with the people who trust you and who you trust. And understanding that it's important to think about disclosure of diagnosis at work. There's a wonderful organization called Triage Cancer who has a lot of resources on disclosure of a cancer diagnosis and how to do that in the work setting. Talks about accommodations that might be needed in the work setting. So understanding that there might be need for these things and understanding that disclosing to colleagues in the work environment who might be part of the supportive group and they might not be. Not all workplaces are exactly the same, and families are unique to themselves. So, honest communication, what does that look like? It looks like empathy, which is a gateway to compassion. It's understanding how someone feels and trying to imagine how you would feel if you were in the situation of the patient or person in your family diagnosed with OM. It's a mode of relating to somebody else. And it's really taking action towards compassion, recognizing the suffering of others, the suffering of our loved one. And it helps to build open and honest relationships with communication. And it really can lead to embodying a tangible feeling of love for the patient, for ourselves, for our families. It's feeling what that person is feeling, holding it, accepting it, and if needed, taking action. So, what are some strategies for coping with challenges? From time to time, our loved one might require extended and unanticipated care, either in a hospital setting or in a clinic setting. And this may completely change the caregivers and the family's routine and lifestyle. If the patient becomes noncompliant and refuses to cooperate or follow instruction, this might be frustrating for us as the family of the patient. And the patient might then require more medical assistance than we anticipated or than the caregiving family has knowledge to provide. And the patient may refuse help from anyone except for their primary caregiver. And if you are that primary caregiver, that can be incredibly burdensome and difficult. And what happens is that there are so many challenges that might come up around being the only person that the patient allows to be cared for. And it's important to have go back to that open and honest communication to say, I'm feeling overwhelmed. I need help. I cannot be the only person caring for you. I love you and I need support too. So understanding that there's a continuum over time between I want to and I have to. And it's important to think about all needs and the needs of each of the members who are supporting the patient. It's important to think about what does self-care look like. If we think about life is extremely dangerous and it changes from moment to moment. We don't know if there will be earthquakes or a cancer diagnosis. We all want to increase our tolerance for ambiguity, and it's incredibly difficult to do that in the midst of a diagnosis, in the midst of a serious health conversation. It's an invitation for us to consider that we are not in control, and that in and of itself can be really triggering not only for the patient but also for the whole family. So there are challenges, as we talked about. There can be mood challenges, difficulty eating, drinking, pain, fatigue, confusion, role changes, and financial changes. We covered some of the challenges. But we haven't been talking about the rewards of caregiving, about caregiver satisfaction. There can be, in fact, increased intimacy. Going through a crisis can make a relationship stronger. There can be existential reflection that leads to conversations that we maybe haven't had with ourselves or another person in our family before. And this can be incredibly satisfying and beneficial to explore meaning, purpose, spirituality. And we can really think about legacy building with our loved one, whether it's a parent, a partner, a child, building together a life review, a reflection, and really bringing the joys of our life to this moment and acknowledging them. We also can model for parents, for children, for our loved one, healthy communication, healthy self care, healthy boundaries, and as well as personal growth. So, this could be an incredible time to grow within ourselves, within our traditions, our rituals, and to understand life in a completely different way where we live it every day to its fullest. We're no longer just looking at the past or rehearsing for the future. We're enjoying and relishing each moment, each sunset. So, what we want to do in order to move towards these possible satisfactions around caregiving is to be proactive wherever possible. Communicate your needs, advocate for the patient, network. There are wonderful networks such as Cure Insight that brought you here today. But there's wonderful supports, perhaps inside your own medical clinic. The clinic where I work, I'm a social worker. We also have dietitians and other supportive needs. We provide resources and connections to support groups and resources that might be needed along the way. But what we want to do in order to be as proactive versus reactive in the moment when challenges do arise is to understand that knowledge is power, to research, ask questions, anticipatory guidance. You can ask what if questions of the treatment team and really think about growth from the experience. Think about there's no single right way to be a caregiver, to be a family member. And caregivers really possess a natural ability to respond and care for their loved ones. It can be, as I mentioned, empathy, caring, listening, supporting. And I really want to highlight humor. Sometimes we cope through humor, and a laugh is the most cathartic thing that we can bring to a situation. Watching a funny movie, finding a way to laugh or bring some type of humor and lightness to a serious situation. That can be really helpful not only to ourselves as caregivers, as family, but also to our patients. So, roles, boundaries, and self care. Creating roles and boundaries within the family, within the entire caregiving system. It's important to realize that self care and prioritizing our own needs as caregivers is not selfish. Caregivers may choose to share their expected roles and responsibilities with the patient. They might establish roles and responsibilities within the local and long distance family. There might be a way to establish there is one point of communication to the social media family. There might be a way to establish how they want to participate in medical appointments. For example, does a caregiver have permission to contact the medical team? It's beneficial to set timelines for work, for home, for caregiving, even if it's for a family member. And times change. Remember that self care can vary from day to day, moment to moment. Nobody more than yourself deserves care. In order to actually be a supportive presence for our OM family member, we have to care for ourselves first and understand when we're overwhelmed and find ways to establish ways to recharge. As I mentioned before, go breathe, take a breath, go for a walk. What is it that resets your system? And you can schedule on a daily basis time just for you. It could be 20 minutes or an hour or longer. That's just for you to recharge. So, what I really want to think about are the different stages of grief, for example. OM reminds us to live every day. Every day matters. We could go through the various stages of grief, even though our loved one is still on the planet. We could be in denial, We could experience feelings of anger. We could be sad, scared. We might bargain with God or higher power. Why is this happening? Why did this happen to my family? Why is my family member dealing with this challenging diagnosis? And sometimes we could be peaceful and accept the diagnosis. As caregivers, as family members of a patient with a diagnosis of OM, we grieve for the loss of our dreams, a life without a cancer diagnosis. We grieve for the loss of the loved one's health or sightedness or changes in roles, changes to the plans for the future, changes for the plans for the family, and the assumption that the life was fair. You might grieve for yourself and your losses as well as your family members' losses. There might be grieving around social, financial, intimacy issues, and the experience that a diagnosis and treatment have had on the entire family structure. And in fact, grief is tricky. Grief brings up other losses in our life, so we might not just be grieving an OM diagnosis of a family member, but also all the other losses that we've had in our life up until now. There's no guide for grief. Grief doesn't just say, I go sadness, anger, denial, bargaining, acceptance, and I'm done. Grief can be retriggered. Grief can be present for an unknown amount of time and unknown treatment needs. So if you find yourself experiencing for a prolonged amount of time a disproportionate amount of sadness or anger, or not being able to cope, feeling overwhelmed, please do seek help. There are resources I met in your communities, in your clinics. We're here because we know that coping with diagnosis of OM is challenging, and we want to be that resource for you. So ask your treatment team for support. Ask them if they have a resource to help with coping. Ask them if they can refer out. And knowing you don't have to do this alone, there are supports for you all along the way. So, as we talked about, self care is really important. And that's why I put this image of put your mask on first. Because if you don't put your mask on first, nobody else is going to be able to put it on for you. And you're not going to be able to help anybody else. There's an entire concept of role change. And so, thinking about the impact of role change on physical and emotional health, neglecting our own needs for healthy living, healthy food, and the burden is the imbalance of care relative to the time and resources the caregiver gives to the multiple other roles and hats that they wear. So, caregiver strain, caregiver burden are important things to notice when you start to feel a challenge. And this last slide, I'm going to talk about caregiver burnout and compassion fatigue. There is a continuum of stress. There is an optimum level of stress. But when we start to find ourselves with reduced efficiency, feeling overloaded, having difficulty concentrating, impact on emotional and physical health, we need to look at ways to bring self care to the forefront, to strive for balance with our social group, our productivity, work and hobbies, emotions, our thoughts and interests, our physical health and exercise, and spiritual, finding meaning and purpose. And here I'm going to leave the last, which is what are some ideas for self care? We've talked a little bit about why self care is important, but here are some ideas around self care. And it's important to bring compassion to the conversation. It's important to think about, do I need to exercise? Do I need to cuddle my animal? Do I need to do yoga, disconnect from the internet, garden, read a book? These are just a few of the ideas that we can use and that we can talk about when we discuss self-care so that we address the impact of diagnosis treatment on the entire family. And I'm going to turn it back over to our host.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer. This was amazing. And just for one, I just want to say thank you.
Sure.
I feel like this is one of those things where it's kind of, I think it's an assumed thing that it's challenging as a patient. But I think that it can definitely be overlooked, like that this is challenging for the spouses, this is challenging for children, this is challenging for parents, sisters, brothers, everybody in the care community is affected, whether you have metastatic disease and you're in active, treatment with constant immunotherapy, or you just had plaque surgery and you had enucleation or whatever happened in your OM journey. Your caregiving team is fully involved as much as they're able to be, and that is, like you said, very taxing and emotionally, just emotionally challenging sometimes. And I like your word. It's a word that I've adopted in my own vocabulary. Instead of calling something hard, I call it tricky, because
Yeah.
if it's tricky, it means I can figure it out. If it's hard, that just kind of puts up this internal barrier in my brain that I can't really deal with as well. Um,
That's
but that
exactly
idea,
right. That's exactly right.
yeah, that idea that we just go, with this diagnosis straight into the unknown, and we have to, just we just have to accept that. And it's like this constant challenge as a patient, I think, also for my family. It's just this constant balancing act of like, okay, we're in the unknown, we're accepting it, we're feeling good, to actually, wow, we don't accept it, and we're having some anger issues about this, and this is frustrating, and this is challenging. Um, so let's look over here in our Q&A real fast. If you guys have any questions for Jennifer, we would love to hear from you. Otherwise, I have a few questions that I can ask her that I have kind of gotten as I've taken some notes. Um, I'm not seeing any questions immediately, so I wanted to ask just real fast. This is kind of more housekeeping, but I feel like the image that you shared of some self care ideas, is that
Yes.
an image that you could send us a high quality image, like email that to Melody?
Yes. I think you have my present. I did send that over. So
Okay.
you can definitely take the image from my presentation. Did you want me to bring that one back up again?
Yeah, let's go ahead and just bring that back up really fast. And
There you go.
perfect. Yeah, I feel like this would be an amazing thing if you're comfortable with us sharing this, that we would love to share this on our social media just so that people can save this and they can have it on hand. Um,
Absolutely.
because I feel like those visuals are awesome. So, what would you suggest as, obviously self care is important, but for someone who's a caregiver or a family member of someone with OM who's noticing, that stress cycle beginning, then
Yeah.
that burnout, kind of the burnout feeling, what would you suggest to them to kind of like maybe active steps, like 1, 2, and 3, for what they should do to kind of get through that and get to a place where they can, better support and actually like manage life?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great for asking that. I think the most important and the first thing to do is recognize that there's a problem. And it's almost taking that kind of 12-step idea that hopefully we have the, wisdom to recognize that there's actually a problem, that something is suffering, that we're more irritable, we're not eating properly, we're gaining or losing weight unintentionally. Thinking about what's happening at work. Am I being productive? Am I able to complete my usual work tasks? Am I crying? What is happening? So whatever it is that dawns on us, that we are not treating ourselves well, that we are in some state of overwhelm, sadness, anger, depression, anxiety, panic. It's important to, after we recognize that there's an issue, decide, do I have healthy coping mechanisms already established? Do I usually go and cook myself something, well, that's healthy? Go hug my dog and cuddle with him in bed because I need that level of support. I need somebody to take care of me. I need that connection with another being, something nice and warm and fuzzy. And I think it's important to be kind to yourself, to understand that you are doing the very best job you can do with your current set of circumstances, with your current knowledge. It's important to share your hopes and dreams, fears with others. Surround yourself with family and friends. And of course, as I mentioned, your pets, people who recharge you. And there are some people who recharge by taking time alone, and there's other people who recharge being with people. So if you happen to know your style for recharge, definitely go that direction and have compassion, because The Buddha says if you're compassionate with yourself, it is incomplete. So, as much compassion and empathy as you can develop for your loved one sitting with OM, it's important to start with yourself. If you like music, if you like sunsets, make sure to create your own support network. There are mentorship agencies that can be a part of the conversation who connect caregivers with other caregivers and reconnect with maybe some lost traditions that might be meaningful to you, whether it's lighting a candle, saying a prayer. It's interesting what I found with a lot of people who do have spiritual traditions that are rich. Sometimes those they're not religious necessarily, but they could be. But it's really the ritual of doing something familiar. So when you come in, you always put your keys in the same place. You greet your family in a certain way, and notice how you're feeling before you go speak to the patient who might be a family member who might be at home. So, what is it you do first? You come in, do you wash your hands, change your work clothes, take 5 minutes, to just sit down and do some breathing. You could journal, but make sure you're getting enough sleep. That's really important. And be mindful of turning to substances like alcohol or drugs. If that's your usual, then there might be an issue. If you're drinking more, marijuana is legal here, smoking more. Um, I'm in California, by the way. So just understanding that you have to set some healthy boundaries for yourself so that you can take care of yourself first and put that mask on first.
I feel like that's a really important point to make, not just for family members, but for OM patients as well, as we're coping with this diagnosis, to recognize, and you don't even really have to name it, as far as what I've kind of understood in all of my self-care learning and podcasting and audiobooks. You don't necessarily have to name it as I'm angry or I'm grieving something. If you can just recognize, whoa, something's off and I
Mm-hmm.
feel different. I feel not myself. I feel, whatever it is, you just start putting names to it, even if it's just a little bit at a time. And that recognition, kind of, the way that I understand it is that it triggers a different area of your brain so that you can not just be in this kind of monkey brain where you're freaking out about it, but you can actually switch over to the logical side of your brain, and you'll be able to handle the situation, and you can kind of start to create solutions.
Yeah.
Um, I loved what you said earlier. You mentioned kind of earlier in the presentation, you asked a lot of different questions that a patient caregiver can ask themselves. And I feel like when we remember that we can be the solution to our own problems and the things that we have going on, um, we are really just a lot more empowered to ask those questions. And then our brain is really good at giving us answers to solve those problems.
Yeah.
So I feel like that is definitely something that can be really, really helpful. I wanted to look and see. We do need to wrap it up, but I guess if we can maybe answer this question briefly, and I think I might know the answer, but I'll going to give you the room to answer this.
Sure.
You mentioned the elephant in the room and just how sometimes this can be difficult for family members and for the patient to talk about. But
Yeah.
at the same time, like we talked about before, it can also feel really isolating if the patient isn't allowed that safe space to talk
That's
about
right.
their diagnosis, to talk about what's going on in their life and what's different, what's challenging, without necessarily feeling like their caregiver is trying to just fix them and that they're actually very actively listening. So,
Right.
how would you recommend the patient kind of go about creating that environment if they don't feel like they have that right now? How would you suggest that they go about doing that?
So establish an open and honest conversation. I like to use the Oreo technique. So you start with something really good, then you get to the meat of it, the meat or the filling of what it is you want to say, and then you end with something good. So in this case, for the caregiver, you could say, "Look, honey, I so appreciate the time you're taking off from work, and I appreciate you accompanying me to appointments and being here and helping me. What I'm really finding that I'm needing is the space to just tell you how scared I am. I feel like sometimes you're wanting to fix me, but what I really need is just an ear to listen. Um, do you think that's something that we could create together? Because I really trust you to really be able to have this conversation with me, but it's difficult for me to ask this for you. and I really love you.
I feel like
If
that's
you
a really good
saw,
technique, the Oreo technique.
that's what I call it. It's to start with admiration, talk about what it is that you need, and then end with admiration and appreciation. So it's using what I talked about earlier was that I statement.
Mhm.
I feel X when you Y. Would you be able to Z? Right?
Gotcha. Yeah,
So
that's a
I
good point.
feel unsafe or unheard when you ignore that this could be, I'm in this phase of the diagnosis, or my diagnosis is metastatic and I'm scared. Would you be willing to let me talk about that? Or is that too scary for you right now? Is that something we could discuss?
I feel like that's a good point too, to just have that discussion. Don't assume as a patient, don't assume that your family member or your friends or your spouse doesn't want to hold that space for you
Yeah,
and that it's too much for them. Give them the opportunity to set the boundary themselves. And
absolutely.
and if they do, then like you said, then that comes to creating or tapping into those resources like counseling, therapy, support groups, where as a patient, I can then turn to someone and say, I'm dealing with this. I know that you get it. I need to work on this so that I can, handle regular life and also cope with the emotions behind this. Um,
Right.
the
Right.
I feel statements when you say blank. One of the things that I love using, like in my own life, is it's from Brene Brown. She has a vulnerability book, and she's got a bazillion books, but there's The Power of Vulnerability, and then her Call to Courage, I believe, is on Netflix. But she
Mhm.
takes it a step further and she says, I feel blank when you say this or you do this, and the story that I'm making up about what this means is blankety blank. Can you help clarify this? Can you help, like, just those kind of communication skills have been really, really helpful for me, not just in this diagnosis but just in like everyday life.
Absolutely.
But I
Absolutely.
think
And
the biggest thing
that's,
comes down to practice. Is that an
yeah,
accurate statement? Like just giving yourself grace to practice this.
absolutely. Brene Brown's also a fellow social worker, a fellow medical social worker, and her work's fantastic. If you haven't come across it yet, please, take a look at some of her TED Talks. They're short and, like you mentioned, on Netflix. And she has podcasts and other things.
Yes.
But it's basic active listening. It's the grounding skill for healthy communication in any relationship with anybody. It's a grounding skill for conflict resolution. When you own how you feel, as opposed to saying, you made me feel, like that energy of like pointing the finger, you made me, as opposed to, I feel a certain way when you speak to me with that tone. Would you be willing to think about the tone you're using when you speak with me?
Yes, that's such a good point. Another book, just if you're listening and you want to snag some books or some other resources, there's a book by the Nagoski sisters called Burnout. She talks about the stress cycle and completing the stress cycle. I found it really fascinating, and it's been helpful, like just in dealing with stressful situations and recognizing that when I'm stuck in that pattern of kind of a depressive state or whatever is going on, that it's part of it is that when my body's constantly in active stress, which it is because I have ocular melanoma and I'm dealing with this every day, I can complete that stress cycle in lots of different ways.
Yeah.
So we actually do need to wrap it up. I apologize, Jennifer, but
No,
we
no
are so
problem.
grateful that
No
you were here
problem.
with us.
It's my pleasure. And thank you so much. And I would just say, to your point about mindfulness that you alluded to, is noticing in your body what sensations are present. That's a tremendous key for understanding emotions and thoughts. So pursue mindfulness education and experience. I can't recommend it enough, because our bodies, our thoughts, and our emotions, our behaviors, those create our reality. So if you need any resources, books, Start Where You Are by Pima Children is a wonderful place to start.
That is amazing. Thank you so much.
It's my
Um,
pleasure.
all right. Well, we're going to say goodbye to Jennifer. Thank you again.
Thank you so much. Thanks for your time. Appreciate
Yeah,
being
thank
here.
you.